Susan Knight to the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Sometimes what we do with these is we ask faculty from the School of Journalism to stand, but today I'd like to ask journalism students, journalists, working journalists, retired journalists, all to stand. Former journalists, retired journalists. Thank you. Welcome. I'm sure this film hits pretty close to home, at least in terms of your values, for all those people who stood. Hi, Jill.
Hi, everybody.
I had a long introduction to tell you all about Jill, and Nancy took care of that. So I think we'll just go straight to the questions. There are two kinds of trust here. We'll get to the journalistic trust, but let's first talk about the trust that editors have to have for the reporters and their producers. I'm sure the Arizona Daily Star doesn't have the same fact-checking and editing process. A daily paper that's putting out a huge number of stories daily. What kind of process do your stories go through? And what's that trust that you have to have for your staff?
Sure. First, I wanted to say the reason that I chose this film for us to view and talk about today is this truly is fake news. This is fabricated either entirely or completely, and it used to be not that common, or it used to be not that, well, it was uncommon, but it was not unheard of. In today's journalistic world, because of technology, this kind of fake news is, I would say, pretty much entirely unheard of, because it is so easy to fact check all this stuff. And you saw this happening in real time in this film. When Stephen Glass was writing these stories, it didn't dawn on him that somebody could very easily check and see if this company was real, if this company had a website, that somebody could very easily check and see if, look on the website of this organization and see if their conference was scheduled for this time and if it was held in this particular place. So in that way, I'm glad to say that this type of fake news is pretty much gone. Fake news in today's world, and the definition that I hear of it pretty much every day when people call me to accuse our industry of it, is basically news that I don't agree with, that they call fake. It's not necessarily fake, it's news you don't agree with. So that I was hoping that we'll talk about that some, but of course Susan's raised an important point too. So the way that it works at the newspapers that I've been in, the news organizations that I've been, which are mostly print-centric, although we're now in the digital world pretty heavily. But pretty much, I've worked at a small, a medium, and a large size paper, this Star being medium. And typically, every reporter works very closely with one editor, as you saw in this film. So they know each other really well. They work together to decide what the reporter is going to write about. Oftentimes, almost always, the editor is somebody who has worked in Tucson as a journalist or had moved here as an editor and is involved in Tucson, so the editors know a lot of people. They get out. Things resonate with editors in terms of the sniff test. Does that sound realistic? Does that sound credible? With Stephen Glass, I think he was on such a tear for everything to be fascinating, for everything to be incredibly interesting. And while we as journalists would love to attain that, it would be great if everything truly was incredibly interesting and every single person you talked to had incredibly fascinating things to say. That's not always the case, and that is something that doesn't often pass that sniff test. If there's something that everybody seems to be incredibly interesting, incredibly articulate, have incredible things to say, it kind of makes you think, does that seem realistic? So there's conversations about what the story is going to be, about who the reporter is speaking with. We don't, magazines like the New Republic, they do employ fact checkers. They're coming out once a month, so it's more realistic for them to do things like that. We don't, largely because of the pace. You know, things are coming out so quickly. Sometimes a reporter will write a story a day, or sometimes multiple stories a day, and there isn't that kind of time. But because of the real-time aspect of what we do now, our community are fact checkers for us. And if something is wrong in one of our stories, from a typographical error in a headline to a small error in fact to a significant error in fact, we hear about it right away. And the good thing about digital journalism is we can change that right away, hopefully before it makes it into print, but not always. But that relationship it's very close. It's ongoing. It's the reporter and editor are talking multiple times a day, and I think that helps prevent something like this.
And in terms of the process of actually editing the stories, this level of fact-checking doesn't go on. You trust the reporters and producers to be telling the truth. The editors don't have time to fact-check every single fact in those stories.
No, but the administrative assistant at the end made an important point that if photographs were around, that's an element of fact-checking. And that's certainly true in the digital world. We ask reporters to take photos when they're there, to bring them back. We put them online, to take snippets of video. We put up source documentation. So if a reporter goes to a meeting and there's a document that's released, we ask them to get a digital copy of that document. We put it on the website. So there's so much of that source material passing through what we do that's sort of inherent live time fact checking, I think.
Some people say that Jason Blair that Jason Blair was an amateur compared to Stephen Glass. What did Jason Blair and Stephen Glass and the others who committed these kinds of fabrications, what kind of impact do you think that had on people calling news fake news today?
Well, tremendous, and that's certainly where it stems from. And for both of them, I think what they did was a little bit different, but similar in that I think it stemmed with both of them from ego, from this desperate need for people to be impressed by them and dazzled by them, which isn't possible in the real world. So,
you said it's much more difficult in today's digital environment for writers, reporters, producers to pull a fast one. Could you talk a little bit about that in terms of the process and what of when you're looking to see if something just doesn't jive?
Well, it takes 2 seconds now to look at a website, to pull up the history of a person, to go on LinkedIn and look at their resume, and certainly that any piece of that can be fabricated, but it's so easy to find so many things that touch a person now that it's pretty easy to get a preponderance of the evidence, I think. It doesn't take that long, and it's not that difficult anymore.
All right, let's open it up to to questions from the audience. Back there, first row.
What would you like to say to a president who repeatedly uses the term fake news as a cudgel and a white paintbrush to paint all journalists?
I don't know if everybody heard the question. Were you finished with the question? Did I cut you off?
No, that's good.
Okay. So what he asked was, what would I say to a president who uses the term fake news to wrap up all of journalism and accuse all of journalism? I find it terrifying, honestly. I think what we do, love it or hate it, are there mistakes in my newspaper every day? Yes, there are. Are there mistakes in any publication every day? Yes, there are. I would be really, really surprised if any of those are intentional. Nobody wants to make mistakes. That's who we are and what we do. But collectively, what we do, I think, is critical to our society. It's critical to our democracy, and to have somebody at the top accuse us with such a broad brush, it's just terrifying. That's been the first step in so many horrible things that have happened worldwide, as you turn the people against the press. And I can't imagine that we would go there this time. I hope to heavens not, but it's terrifying.
How many recommendations to how to counter that haven't already suggested?
It's very difficult, and people call me not every day, but most every day, who agree wholeheartedly with what our president says about the press. And I found that there's really nothing that I can say to to sway them, which is frustrating. We just keep doing what we're doing and hope that people will continue to see the value. A lot of the accusations about things being biased, things being fake are at the national level, and people call me regularly and ask, why can't you have a reporter who's in Washington, doing this story or that story? And the reality is we don't have reporters anywhere except for Tucson, and the national stories that we're running are all stories that are done by syndicated wire services, and we pick from the ones that we subscribe to. And we do realize that there's a lot of people in our community who are very supportive of our president, and we try very hard to find stories, not necessarily that praise him or hold him up, but that people who appreciate him would appreciate the stories. And I will say it is hard to find those types of stories. We have on our editorial page done a really wholehearted transformation where we've really tried to add a stronger local voice. We're doing local editorials again, which we had stopped a number of years ago. We've added, on top of that, we added more space, we added more letters, we added more local stuff. We're inviting more people to write columns for us, and they run every day. But in addition to that, we've added quite a lot of conservative voices. So we added a couple of local conservative voices. We're running a couple of conservative columnists. We're running about 6 or 7 conservative syndicated columnists. And if you didn't know who's conservative and who's liberal, you would think, and people call and they say everything in your editorial page is liberal, but what they don't realize is many of those people are conservative. They hold deep conservative values, and they don't support what's happening in our administration right now. So their voices read as quite liberal, even though they're quite conservative. Same with the conservative cartoonists. So we really are trying, and it's really, really difficult.
One other point that I would add about fake news is that it's a hugely broad term, and that I think it helps all of us to have media literacy, to teach media literacy to everybody in our lives, and break it down. Some fake news is outright propaganda. Some fake news is stories planted by special interests. Some fake news is just what Donald Trump doesn't like. And as Jill said, some fake news is just what the reader, the listener, the viewer doesn't like. So I think it's really important to talk to people about what do they mean by fake news, and to sort of reestablish that there is a very important place in our democracy for a fourth estate, and that to so broadly paint a brush with this term fake news does a huge disservice to maintaining a free press. So, okay, over here and then over here.
I appreciate the approach of let's just do what we do and do it the best way we can, and the proof will be in the pudding. But what are some of the guidelines that you ask of your reporters on any regular stories that will reinforce credibility?
Oh, that's a great question. The question is, what do we do on a regular basis to increase credibility of what we do? Whenever possible, we ask reporters to get 2 sources. I should not say whenever possible. We ask reporters to get 2 sources of information. So if someone tells you something, then either confirm that with somebody else or look it up in a document. We're very big on, there's a big paper trail in our society now, and you can often find stuff on paper. We try extremely hard not to use anonymous sources. I think that's more important now with ever, because so much of what's coming out of Washington is anonymous. So much of what's coming out of our local news, I don't think should be anonymous. We have a really strict standard that if somebody will be deeply wounded by us publishing their name, which means they risk their life, they risk their job, something that's really significant, and there's absolutely no other way we can get that story, then we will have a conversation about it. And it's a long, deep, difficult conversation. We do not do that lightly. And the other standard is something that is of great community concern. And again, same standard, it has to be something that there's absolutely no other way for us to get. And there's been many stories that we knew we knew that they were correct, and we didn't publish them because we just didn't feel that it was solid enough on the record. And sometimes we'll go back to those and try to get people to go on the record or try to get new documents, but we're very, very strict about that.
And I'll add, at the education level, at the higher education level, we insist that all of our students have 3 or more sources per story. We encourage them to think critically about who their sources are and why those people are the best sources for the story. So hopefully we are maintaining and carrying on that tradition. We also don't let our students use anonymous sources. Very, very seldom will a student use an unnamed person. It has to meet the same standards as it does if they were working in the industry, or possibly even tougher. Many professors just say, not at all. Over here?
Yeah, so you were talking about the media literacy. So I have two questions, like whose responsibility it is to work towards fostering media literacy in today's world, and why do you think now, at this very age of the 21st century, people still can be easily fooled with the term of fake news when everyone has access to news at all and different media platforms?
Okay, so the question was, whose responsibility is it to teach media literacy in this day and age? And also in this day and age, when people have so much access to information, why do we have such an issue of fake news? Is that correct?
Yes.
I'll let Susan take the news literacy part of it, but for why people are easily fooled, I don't think it's that they're easily fooled. I think most people, and there's been a lot of research to back this up, they want to read stuff that they agree with. So if you are on either end of the spectrum, you seek out information that supports your point of view. And on those extremes, on both sides, is where a lot of the fictional stuff is, a lot of the, just flat out the fake websites, the stories that are true propaganda. You don't see that so much in the middle, but out on the extremes, there's a ton of that.
I would say my answer on whose responsibility it is to teach critical thinking and the idea of news literacy, I speak for myself and not for the School of Journalism. I'll just say that. I believe that our K-12 programs have fallen down in that area. With the increase in standardized testing, I feel that there's less attention to critical thinking. And that's nothing against the K-12 teachers who work so hard. It more has to do with a policy decision at the state level and in the national level. But I feel that we would be in a really good place if the pendulum could start swinging back the other way, and that we could work with people from a very early age to have a BS meter, to not just take everything off the internet as truth, and to be able to think critically and ask questions and be curious. Unfortunately, curiosity and asking questions is condemned by some people in the highest offices right now. So I think that on many levels we're facing a lot of challenges for news literacy.
I think we had a question back there. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I really like the optimism as far as keeping fake news out of the press. So within the last 6 months, how many instances of fake news have you guys caught, or something like fake news, going through the editorial process?
In terms of a fake story or something like that, we haven't had any.
Okay, well, and so the reason I'm asking is because there's a similar problem in academia right now, where there's this need to push papers, need to be novel and unique, but then you end up with a lot of fake papers getting published. And so like one of the major ones is the p-hacking thing, where you're finding significance in studies just by chance. And it's like a major debate right now as far as like how do we combat that. And so it seemed like the two stories were similar, and it was a little bit just like when you're saying, hey, it's so easy to fact check this stuff. In academia, it turned out not to be so easy to fact check.
I think an important distinction there is we have intentionally taken some of the pressure off our reporters that you don't have to have the perfect story right now. I don't care. Breaking news is important to us, but I would always rather get something right than have it first. I really don't care. I truly don't care if we have it 2 minutes before the TV stations in town. I don't care at all. I care if we have it right. And so I would hope that our reporting staff feels that in their heart, because I certainly do. And I hope they don't feel that pressure to crank it out to be first at all costs, to be quick at all costs, because that's not going to lead us to the future.
Arizona Cap?
I agree with you. Fake news is a very broad term that doesn't really encapsulate maybe what perhaps is a spectrum of problems with reporting. The other spectrum are reporters who are deeply influenced by public relations vehicles that are interested, for economic reasons largely, to influence public opinion, to shape those interests and develop those interests part of the economy. This runs from like ExxonMobil to the millions and millions of dollars that are spent on PR firms. And I guess as educators, how can you get your students, and this is I guess the second part of it, which is somewhat what you're saying, because there's a big economic force for students too. They've got huge student loan debt. They've got professors who need to distinguish themselves. But how as educators are you going to make sure that there is that balanced and fair reporting on the issues that are confronting the American people? And with that in mind, I see a huge distinction these days between things like BBC, right? Even Al Jazeera, and the New York Times and the Washington Post, who are influenced by those special interests.
Okay, so the gentleman's asking a question about organizations that have a motivation to influence the news media, whether it's economic or otherwise, and what do we do to teach our students to, I guess, think critically about the motivations for that, for not being swayed by that influence, but using news values to determine if this is truly a story or not a story. And that's what it's all about. That's what journalism education is all about. And that's why we have them for 4 or 5 years, and we harangue them and we harass them. And you can ask some of those people right back there in that back row. We picket them and we ask them to think. And why do you think that source is saying that? And we forbid them to write strictly from press releases. We've been told by some of our alumni who go to work at other places around the country are horrified and contact us and say, Professor Knight, I can't believe what this student is doing from XYZ University. I won't name them. You know many of them. And so I hate to be a broken record, but I think it's critical thinking is to really teach students to not just take what's coming to them, but to take it, analyze it, filter it, think about it, ask questions about it, expand on it, and make sense of it. Jill, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would say that basically that just comes down to the difference between a good reporter and a bad reporter, is basically the gist of it. the PR machine is the strongest in business journalism, and that's where I've spent most of my career. I was many years on the board of the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, and was president in a few years back. So I know business journalism well. I know how influential public relations people want to be and can be within that world, and I know that good journalists greatly value public relations people for getting access to the executives that they want to talk to, for double checking information, for fact checking, for basics like that. But I don't know a good journalist who uses a public relations person as a source of critical information. I would say that's locally and nationally.
And similarly, we encourage the same skepticism. We're not just picking on press releases, but every website that's out there. We're constantly telling students to not take things from websites. Information may have changed. Information needs to be fact-checked, needs to come from a human being who can answer questions about it, etc. Other questions? First row on the left. Yep.
Hi, I'm going to ask you a question and say something from a slightly different angle. I know that the whole world isn't made up of journalists. A lot of us are readers, responders, and reactors. So we're going to talk from that angle. And I'm also going to talk about youth. So this Friday, there's the 6th Annual Youth and Peace Conference here in Tucson for high school students at Pima Community College. And one of the workshops is online and loving it. And what the students that are, and that workshop filled up first, by the way. And what the students are being asked to do in that workshop is to think and produce some policies of what they, in 3 areas. Ways to respond to social media stuff that you see, which could be fake or not. Ways to post items that are of importance to you, and ways to think about the future of these items. So that's, because I know I agree about teaching critical thinking, but you can't just teach it. You have to let them do it. And so if you have comments about that, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Questions? I think you had your hand up, and then we'll go here next, Peggy.
Yeah, I was
Yes.
wondering if you could give an example of a situation, I don't know, with publications that you worked with where you did discover that something was inaccurate and what the retraction process was. And just as an aside, I'm in the process of reading a book called Trust Me, I'm Lying. And basically the guy talks about, somebody's nodding their head, yeah, I read that. So, that the story comes out on page 1, but when you retract it, it's on page 7. So if you could just talk to that at all.
If we retract anything, it's always in the same place, which is the bottom of page 2, unless it's something really major. Like if an entire story was wrong, or the main premise of the story was wrong, and it was a significant story that we had on the front page or really blasted across our website, then we put that correction on the front page. That's pretty rare. The instances that I have dealt with, it hasn't been people making anything up. It was, somebody completely misunderstood something and got the premise wrong. And in that case, we run a correction, and the more significant the error, the larger and more significantly we place the correction. I have known of other publications that had instances like this, and in every case, as in this, once the editors got onto it, there was a major investigation and the person committing the act was fired. I've never known anybody who has been allowed to keep their job after anything remotely like this.
Peggy?
Yeah, I just was curious if the Star has had any policy changes since the inauguration this year. For instance, I think NPR now has changed it. They used to never use the word lied or liar, and now they have decided that sometimes that's appropriate. The New York Times published some really dirty language from Scaramouche, unedited, feeling it was important enough to break that rule of, have you had that, faced that?
Let me just see, did people in the back hear that? No. Okay, the question was about, has the Star changed its policy regarding the use of the word liar?
Well, that and swearing, just anything.
Swearing, many publications have changed their public their policies, such as NPR. So the question was, since the inauguration, has the Star changed its policy regarding issues like that?
We haven't had a policy change, but we are open to some pretty coarse language for only one reason, and that it's if that is important to tell the story. And in many cases, it is, like the Trump Inside Edition audio. We ran quite a lot of that. We didn't run a lot of the Anthony Scaramucci stuff. We sort of alluded to what he said. But yeah, if and particularly the more the higher position the speaker is in, the more likely we are to run something like that, and that would go for something very ignorant, the person might say, consistent, really bad grammar. If you are somebody who shows up at a city council meeting as a private citizen and you stand up and say something really boneheaded, we're not going to report that. We don't have any interest in making a private citizen look stupid. But if you're a city council member and you show up at, a Girl Scout meeting and say something really outrageous, where you might think that you have some expectation of privacy, but you're in a group of people, we are much more likely to report that.
Back there?
Do you have any comments on the fact that protections are available to journalists? I'm thinking specifically of the Russian journalist who had to leave Russia when she got a prestigious award for telling the truth, and also the dangers to Mexican journalists in terms of the drug wars that are happening around the border. Hopefully we don't have anything like that in the U.S., but nevertheless, a journalist is putting it out on the line when they're covering stories that can have personal ramifications.
Sure, and what we deal with, the pushback that we get from readers here can be frustrating, but of course it's nothing like there are journalists all over the world who truly are putting their lives on the line. There are American journalists occasionally who are killed covering conflict overseas, but for particularly Mexican journalists, it's a fact of their everyday life. There are Mexican journalists who are killed pretty much every month, and they keep doing what they're doing so bravely. It's really admirable.
I think we as educators have a responsibility to our students who are becoming journalists to teach them how to function out there with protest. And some of the students who are here represent some of our 10 journalism clubs in the School of Journalism. And at a planning meeting yesterday, some of them asked to have workshops on being safe out in the field. We have had a number of students covering protests where they've encountered aggression, and the faculty has actually talked about where can we fit that in to our curriculum regularly, about one, being safe and taking care of yourself, but also knowing how to interact in a compassionate way as a reporter when you're dealing with hostilities and victims and things like that. So it's something that's come from our students just as recently as yesterday, saying that they really want to have more training in that. I don't know if that partially addresses, it looks like it does, what you were asking about, but I think those are very real conditions for people who are reporting. And you can be in Tucson or Nogales. You don't have to be, in the Middle East or Washington, D.C. or somewhere else to experience those kinds of things. So.
There's a question right behind the bar there.
We've been hearing and reading lately about the purchase of, I think, TV and radio stations by a particular company all across the country, and that company has a really conservative viewpoint, and then so the editorial function of those stations and the reporting on those stations is being influenced by what that company wants to see put out. And I'm wondering if you've heard about that and how you prepare your students to go out into a world looking for a job or at a place where, you know, their values are going to be compromised, but they need a job.
Good question. I think that it's nothing new, and we should be teaching it all the time. I mean, if we really think back to the early days of journalism in this country, our founding fathers created a free press that was a very partisan press. And so I think that that's something, I know when I was in journalism school, that different professors would ask you when you were going out for job interviews, how much research have you done on this company? Do you know who owns it? Do you know what their point of view is? So I think we continue to do what we've always done, which is to encourage students to know what they're getting into and to understand the industry. And there are, Rupert Murdoch's been around for a while. We've all been watching the situation in Las Vegas, Nevada, where somebody took over the paper and most of the staff left because of the way that the publisher was, the expectations that the publisher had for reporting. So I think any good journalist is going to pay attention to the values and the motivations of their publishers.
And I'm not sure what company you're referring to, but that I would want to investigate and see if that's true, because we hear that from time to time that, for example, someone will say Jim Click buys a lot of ads in the Star, so you all would never write anything bad about Jim Click. We don't make any of our editorial decisions based on advertising. They're very separate. The only thing I do is when we are writing a story that one of our advertisers is not going to be pleased with, I tell our publisher. He doesn't even read the story. I just tell him what it is because he wants to be prepared when he gets the phone call. He never says, don't do it. We'll talk about, are you absolutely sure you have the facts right? Is this an important story? If yes, then go for it. But in any sort of publication that's of the size where there is an editorial department and an advertising department, I'd be really surprised if that is the case, unless it's a partisan sort of a publication. Where that would happen, I would imagine, there's tons of very small publications now. One person who runs a website, they write news stories and they sell advertising, so they have to do that, to bring in some money and pay the bills. I don't know how those people make those decisions, but I'm sure it's an awful lot trickier if you're asking for, Joe's tire shop to give you money for an ad, knowing that you're working on a negative story about the tire industry. It would get sticky. But for us, they're very separate functions, very separate departments, and they don't mix.
One more question? Way back there, red shirt.
Okay. I'm an engineer, so I have to go back and look at root cause. Two things that struck me about this that you haven't really said on. One of them is the existence of a byline seemed to be a real reason why this happened. In other words, the idea of a famous reporter seems to me should be an oxymoron, right? Why the desire to be famous was part of this, and how do you make that compatible with being a reporter that's objective? And the second part is what you kind of said, the editors wanted a cool, sexy story, and it was kind of fun. But another element of these stories was that they kind of all stuck it to the man, so to speak. They all had a slightly conservative bent associated with, or an anti-conservative bent, I should say, about business and politics. And so there seemed to be a certain editorial bias for wanting to believe the story. How do you address those two things?
The question is about, I'll address the byline part of it first. I think that's absolutely true with both Stephen Glass and Jason Blair. Their reason for wanting to be a journalist was, like he told those kids, getting your name in print. That's, in my experience, almost 30 years in this business, the people who I have worked with who are journalists are not in it for bylines, they really, truly want to serve their community. We see this as a public service that we're performing, that we are spreading information to help the people who live in our communities understand what's going on, to be better citizens. It truly, for good journalists, the byline and the glory and all that, it just doesn't play into it. The reporters who are wanting to win big awards and big prizes, it's fun, and everybody likes it, but it's usually for a lot of people to to move along in their career, to move up in their career, to get a better job. But the personal glory, it really doesn't play into it, except for people like that.
Just to add a little bit to that, I think that in every profession there's ego, there's grandstanders. And I would agree that in print, a lot of journalists prefer to remain, to maintain that curmudgeon, separate, quiet observer role. I think increasingly in our society, we do have people out there whose egos drive them to make names for themselves. And there are a lot of people in media, especially at the national level, I think, who are seeking more of an entertainment value for the work that they do, as opposed to a journalistic value. And again, that's something that we try to help students tease out in journalism school. Are you going to be doing journalism, or are you looking to make a name for yourself as a commentator, an entertainer? So the lines are kind of blurry these days in some areas.
What about the second part of his question, as far as the pressure from the top? You're addressing the rank and file reporters. When the culture of the company is dictating a certain bias?
So to repeat for those of you who might not have heard it, he said, what about the second part of the question, which is, what about the pressure from the top? And this goes to the question that you were asking also, the influence on the publisher, the owner, the board of directors. And in your case, in the case of many newspapers these days, is the stockholders.
I've worked for 3 newspapers. It's never trickled down into the newsroom. I'm sure there are places where it does, but I've never felt it.
One example I would give of that is when the Arizona Daily Star back in the 80s did the investigative reporting and won the Pulitzer for it on looking at malfeasance in the Department of Athletics at the University of Arizona. And a lot of people were so upset that the Arizona Daily Star would go after the only game in town, and something that they should be boosters for. And a lot of people dropped their advertising, and some of the car dealers briefly dropped their advertising, but I bet the Star would still do that story today. And again, I think that demonstrates the break between allowing that trickle-down influence from the owners and the publishers. Do we have time for one more? I see a bunch of questions, hands going up. There was one in the back, in the middle. Yes.
I think what we're trying to get at here is not so much like your newspaper, the publishers, but you expressed earlier how people have a tendency to believe what they already believe. And I think the question is, how much is that happening with journalists? You have publications you recognize as liberal, or publications you recognize as conservative. An example is the Rolling Stone piece on the rape that wasn't a rape. But it wasn't questioned because it was assumed you should believe the victim, when in fact, to be an objective reporter, you have to even ask the tough, uncomfortable questions. So how do we help these students to be objective when there's such a sway to push toward one direction or a set of beliefs or another?
So in a society where there are liberal publications, there are conservative publications, how do we encourage students to be somewhere in the middle? Is that basically?
To remain objective, because we need the reporters to not just believe somebody because it fits in with their worldview. How do they step out of that and remain the objective reporter that says, I have to question everybody, whether I, in my heart, believe them,
right.
My head has to take precedence.
Well, first I would say some of the publications that people identify as liberal and conservative aren't necessarily so. Like, I think people think that our editorial page particularly is very, very liberal. And like I said, we've added all kinds of conservative stuff in there, but people don't necessarily notice, or it doesn't necessarily read conservative. You mentioned something in the middle about, the Rolling Stone story. That's just sloppy reporting. That any good reporter, it's not that you're pressing people, prove to me that what you're saying is true, but a reporter on a story like that is going to spend so much time with the source, be that the victim or the investigator, whatever it is. They're going to be going perhaps to the scene if the victim is comfortable with that. They're going to be going through testimony, through who said what, or where were you. I mean, there's so much detailed conversation that goes into reporting a big story like that, and you just have to double check everything. And that reporter, I believe, was quite inexperienced. Just stories like that, when something like that happened, it makes the news, because thank God it is pretty unusual. But reporters, for the most part, they dig in, and it's not that you're pinning someone to the wall and saying prove it, which you kind of are, but in a very subtle way. You're looking at documents, you're having conversations. Well, you said that your brother was there, can I talk to him? You said that there was this lady there who was from Victim Witness, what was her name? I'm going to talk to her. That's just the course of good reporting. You talk to so many more people than end up in the story, and you just cover every conceivable base.
And this is probably a good place to end, and I'll answer simply for you. Hopefully we learn from our mistakes. And I think when the Rolling Stone rape story broke, journalists all over the country, as well as my colleagues in the School of Journalism, and probably every school of journalism around the country, were reading every piece that came out and every commentary on it to try to figure out where the breakdown was. And one of the things that reporter said is that she took the, quote, victim's word that somebody didn't want to talk to the reporter. And that is sloppy reporting. No reporter should take one person's word that another person doesn't want to be interviewed. So hopefully we learn from our mistakes. The mistakes of Jason Blair, the mistakes, if they can be called, I think you called them hijinks at the beginning. I thought, oh man, I think of it as so much more serious than journalistic hijinks. Hopefully that's just beer and pizza on election night, but hopefully we do learn from our mistakes. And the danger is, if we don't learn from our mistakes, are we in danger of losing the freedom that we have in this country for a free press? And I am so passionate about it and believe that it's absolutely necessary for a working democracy. And so that I hope we don't sweep everybody in media with the terminology fake news and then pull back the freedoms. So I want to thank you all for coming today. Thank you to all of the sponsors of the event, and good way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Thank you.